Hey everyone, it's a real honor to be able to introduce Sera to you today. When Chuck asked me, I was like, hell yeah, I'll introduce her. I met Sera, I think it was in 2012, at a conference in Freeport, Maine that she and David Cohen and Bob Whitaker were speaking at. And I remember I saw her across the room and she was sitting up against a wall barefoot. That's, if you know Sera, you'll know she often doesn't wear shoes, which I love because, you know, it's just a way of doing things outside of conventional boxes. And ever since I met her, she's been a friend and a mentor and a role model for me. She's been a critical part of envisioning and planning and getting the Western Mass, or the whole recovery learning community model off the ground. And she's led the Western Mass recovery learning community for 10 years now, is that right? And the RLC, if you're not familiar with it, please go to westernmassrlc.org. It's such, I get emotional every time I talk about it because what they have built there is, it's not about mental health, it's about community, and it's about justice and equality, and looking at how deep the roots go of this thing we call mental illness at the structural level, class, race, economics, gender. They're really showing how you can create a community and support one another outside of the system. And also what they do in these, and what Sera is so skilled at, is they find ways to work with the system that don't, you know, surrender their values, but that also don't close off access to people who are lost in the system and stuck in the system. And Sera really is, she's too humble to say this, but her mind and her heart and her spirit are at the core of everything that the RLC is all about. She's a mother and an activist and a writer, and I just have learned so much from her over the years, and I'm really honored to be able to bring her up here to speak with you today. Thanks.
All right, 1 second. Okay, is that good?
That's good.
Okay. Sorry, positioning papers. So when I share parts of my story, which I'm going to do a little bit here, I usually start with my first diagnosis having been major depression, and that's not actually accurate. My first diagnosis was actually anorexia, and I was 17, and I went to a psychiatrist who asked me some questions, but not the right questions. And had he asked me the right questions, I don't know that I would have answered, because he was some guy that I had just met. But I had been raped the year before in my college dorm by a man who said, "I've never had to force anyone before." I remember exactly what was happening when he said that. And so after that happened, I had started to look for some way to control my surroundings because everything felt out of control. I remember I stopped getting my period for months from the stress of it. And I remember driving for 45 minutes to get an HIV test because I had heard that he had been having sex with as many people as possible because he had HIV and he was trying to spread it, and that was the only place I could get an anonymous test. And that was the first human services worker that I might have told that I interacted with at that test, except that she started asking me all these questions, like who had I been having sex with and what drugs had I been doing, and giving these really judgmental responses when I told her. So I didn't tell her anything else. And that's what this became. So this became, by the time someone did try to give me help, this became anorexia. And what did I get for that? I got some psychiatric drugs that kept me up for several days in a row, which wasn't particularly helpful. And I just tried to move on with my life. And then by the time I was in my early 20s, I had gotten several more diagnoses. They included major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and borderline personality disorder, which is my personal favorite. As you might imagine, I think I earned it because my relationships were really chaotic, and I was talking about suicide, and I was self-harming. I was cutting and burning myself a lot. And again, nobody asked me why I was doing any of those things, and I could have told them. Maybe not as articulately as I can tell you now, but I could have told them that sometimes I felt like I was floating so far out of my body, and I was looking down upon myself living this life, and that helped ground me and bring me back to my body. And that in this world that felt so out of control to me, that sometimes this gave me some control over the pain I was experiencing. So instead, I just got these diagnoses. And I noticed that here, something has popped up over my PowerPoint. So, okay. So I guess what I'm going to be talking to you about today is context, because that's the whole theme of this whole conference, right? And just in that little bit of my story, you can see how not important that was to people in my life, that what I'd been through just wasn't important. And actually, what was important to people seemed to be controlling me, seemed to be taking away all the things that I had learned to survive because it made them uncomfortable or because they thought it was their job. So if you look at this cover slide I have, it's all these little pictures, but actually, what it actually is this mosaic of the Queen that hangs in Gatwick Airport in England, and you're going to see that I have a lot of images like that throughout this. The sort of, if you get too close, you just see some little piece of it. If you step back, you see what the whole picture is. And I also have lots of quotes throughout this, and I'll read them. I don't generally like to read slides to people, but I will read the quotes at least. So this first quote is, "For me, context is the key. From that comes the understanding of everything." Kenneth Noland. So does anyone recognize this guy? No? His name is David Rosenhan, and he was with us until 2012. Has anyone heard of the Rosenhan experiments? I see a handful of hands. So I'm going to talk about these experiments a little bit, but first I'm going to read this quote that is from David. "The facts of the matter are that we have known for a long time that diagnoses are often not useful or reliable, but we have nevertheless continued to use them." So now these experiments that he did, they're reminiscent of some of the things that we've heard other people talking about throughout these last few days, but I love these experiments. I talk about them whenever I can. They started with the first part, which was this pseudo-patient experiment. There were 8 people, 5 men, 3 women, who went to a hospital. Actually, they went to 12 hospitals across 5 states and were instructed to say particular things. Now, before I get there, let me just tell you, of those 12 hospitals they went to, some of them were rural, rundown hospitals, some of them were pretty well-run, university-connected hospitals, and one was a private, expensive, self-pay hospital. Remember that, because that's going to come back up in just a moment. Okay, so they were supposed to go. They were a mix of people. They were a psychiatrist, a pediatrician, some psychologists, of which David Rosenhan was one, a homemaker, a painter, etc. They were supposed to go, and they were supposed to say, "I'm hearing a voice," and it's saying something like thud, or hollow, or empty. They chose those words because they weren't documented anywhere else as some, particular sign of anything, and so they went, and all of them were hospitalized. They all received the diagnosis of schizophrenia except for one. One got what was seen as a less severe diagnosis of manic depression, bipolar of their day. Guess which hospital gave them the less severe diagnosis?
The private one.
Yep, the private expensive one. So you start to see the intersection of class and money and things that go on in this diagnostic system that we have. So they ended up being hospitalized between 7 and I think it was 50 some odd days. The average hospitalization was 19, but here's another important point. When they got there, they were told to just go back to being themselves. They were told, stop saying you're hearing any voices, just go back to whoever you are. But everything was now seen through that lens. So when they wrote notes, for example, they were seen as paranoid. And everything was interpreted in that way. All the other parts of who they were kind of covered over with this diagnosis. And they went through this process. The person who was in there for 50 some odd days actually had to be sprung. They weren't going to let them out. Yeah, and all of them had to accept their diagnosis and accept the psychiatric drugs that had been prescribed to them in order to get out. Now, when I say that everyone thought that they were real patients, no one realized what was going on, there's one exception to that. Can you guess who might have noticed that maybe they didn't belong there?
The patient.
Yep. Other people who were hospitalized recognized, they thought maybe they were reporters doing some sort of investigative journalism kinds of thing. So they got it. So, when I think about this, when I hear this story, I get a little angry. But there's a second part to the story, so let me tell you that before I talk about my anger. So the second part is, as you can imagine, the hospitals were not thrilled with this experiment. They were kind of angry. So David decided that with one particularly upset hospital administration, they would offer another experiment. And this experiment was to tell the hospital, we are going to send you fake patients. All you need to do is figure out which ones. So over the course of however long it was, there were 193 people were seen. 41 of them were determined to be fake patients, and another 42 were suspected. Guess how many were actually fake patients? Yeah, zero. So I think there's so many different ways to talk about the problems with diagnosis, and as I said, we've heard some of them as we go, but this one is so powerful. It speaks so strongly to how we are influenced by what we are told is science and truth, and then how we see the people in front of us because of that. And so when I think about this, and I think about my own story, it makes me so angry that we've been seeing this for decades, and yet this is the kind of experience that I had, where, by the time that I was seeing psychologists and psychiatrists, so many things had happened to me, and it just didn't matter. So my second quote is, reality is not a function of the event as event, but of the relationship of that event to past and future events. Robert Penn Warren. I know the word context isn't in there. It's the only quote where context isn't in there, but still about context. So when I talk about anger, by the time I was in front of psychologists and psychiatrists, not only had I been raped, but I had also experienced childhood sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. I'd experienced neglect. I remember as a 5-year-old being left with my infant brother to care for him alone, and how terrified I was, and that kept happening. I remember being 7, and I'm really ashamed to share this, but sometimes I do. My brother, who was a toddler at that point, I used to tell him that our mother was never coming home because he'd get upset, and then he'd want to hug me, and that's what I needed. I needed some physical contact, some human contact, and so I would start to do these terrible things to try and figure out how to get that. And then I had also had this experience in college that taught me something else about myself that really changed the course of where I went from there. I had already learned that I couldn't trust the people who had been chosen for me, my family. But then in college, I had this experience where I had this really close friend. We were both 16. We were terrified to be away from home. We got really close. We took these long drives late at night, and he would tell me all these things about his life, that his favorite song was Lady in Red. They had a crush on the girl in third violin back in high school. And then right after I transferred to another college, he picked up a gun, and he went around campus. And he ended up shooting a number of people and killing a professor and another student who had been in my entering class of 23 kids, and became one of the first well-publicized school shooters. And so what that taught me was that not only can I not trust the people who have been chosen for me, but I can't trust the people who I was choosing. I can't trust myself. And that was a really powerful message for me to carry forward with me. And then I'm with these psychologists who are talking to me about chemical imbalances, and who are talking to me about needing to take psychiatric drugs for the rest of my life, and that I have all these diagnoses. And what I realized that was doing for me is it was erasing me. It was making me invisible. It was making everything that happened to me invisible. And I didn't realize it then, at least not on a conscious level, but what I realize now is it also was giving a pass to everyone around me who had hurt me. So the people who had raped and hit and hurt me in any number of different ways, it didn't matter, right? It was all in my head. This would have happened anyway. It was my problem, not their problem. I needed to look at myself. That was the message that I took from what people told me in the system. Fortunately, at some point, I started to realize that maybe the system was not where I needed to find my answers. So this is one of my favorite quotes. It's from one of my favorite childhood books, The Phantom Tollbooth. "Is everyone who lives in ignorance like you?" asked Milo. "Much worse," he said longingly, "but I don't live here. I come from a place very far away called context." So when I talk about all of this, I guess what I really hope that some of you will take away is how powerful some of these messages are, how powerful some of the language is. I think that when I tell my story, even in conferences like this, I still end up feeling erased a lot of the time. Even in the most progressive conferences, because people are still talking in mental illness and client language and all these things that have made me feel invisible. And people will often come up to me and they'll say, "Your story was so powerful, thank you for sharing. It was so courageous." By the way, most of us don't really like to hear how courageous we are when we get up and tell our stories. Like, it's okay. It's actually not that courageous for me to tell my story. This has gotten pretty easy. What's courageous is to deal with some of the comments afterward. Honestly, that's the hard part. So just bear that in mind when you decide what you want to say. But I'm not separate from the people that I stand with in this movement. And sometimes what happens is that people will say, "Oh, that's a great story," and then they'll go on talking about everybody else as if nothing has changed. And I'm not separate from those people. My story is both what makes me unique, but also what connects me to the rest of the people in this movement. So when you talk about other people as if they're objects, you're still talking about me. And I hope that you'll take that forward with you. I know it's not easy to figure out what are the right things to say, and there is no such thing as the right word list. But if you listen, hopefully, to the values and the things that have hurt us, that will help guide you. Now, I do teach about language a lot back in Massachusetts, and one of the things that I've heard sometimes is, "No, listen, I hear what you're saying, I totally get it, but the place I work, if I don't talk about people like this, I won't be taken seriously. I work in this hospital, I work in this," insert wherever someone is working. "I work in this place where if I don't call people these kinds of words, then no one will understand what I'm saying or no one will take me seriously." And then I had a student in one particular class who said, but if I see someone flinch when I call them a client or a patient or a schizophrenic or whatever, then I'll stop. Now I made this slide for that training after that conversation, and it's a regular part of the curriculum now. So let me just ask you, which person do you worry about more? Anybody? Who do you worry about more? Melvin. Right, because he doesn't flinch. Because sometimes what happens in the system is that people's fire goes out. Their sense of self gets totally lost, and that's when they stop flinching. And it's the people whose fire has gone out, that internal sort of burn that says, "No, fuck you, stop talking about me in this way, let me have my voice here." It's those people who get stuck. I got lucky in a lot of ways because I'm a pain in the ass. I am non-compliant. I say that non-compliant saved my life, because as hard as it was, and I still struggle. I still struggle with a sense of abandonment and not being good enough and all of these things, but I also have this internal rejection of so many things that I'm told about myself, and that saved me. That saved me from being that person who doesn't move when people talk about them in that way. So bear that in mind. Making mental connections is our most crucial learning tool, the essence of human intelligence, to forge links, to go beyond the given, to see pattern, relationships, context. Marilyn Ferguson. So, some of you might know I write on Mad in America a lot, and I have a particularly favorite article that I want to share with you that I think really applies here. And technically, actually, I love them all. If you're a writer, part of the writing process is writing until you fall in love with a piece, sort of fine-tuning it until it's something you really can feel great about. So I love them all, but I particularly love this one. It's called Killjoy, the story of a misguided mental health bot. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen the surge of these weird artificial intelligence things that are showing up everywhere and trying to pretend to be a real therapist or a real helper of some sort. They are terrifying. They are a bad sign. As we sit here and we talk about needing to know context, needing to look at the bigger picture, needing to have genuine human connection, here are people who are saying, "Nope, not so important." Here, have this program that will pretend to be human. We're not even going to tell you, there's lots of unsuspecting people, 1 million according to Danny the creator, who have interacted with this thing under the guise of help. Now, I spent a long time in my research for writing my article, Playing with Joy. Here are some samples of what I got. Just a few. There are many. I lost my job today. Happy birthday. Well, this is call for celebration. I mean, that's not even a lack of context. I don't know how to explain that one. Hi there, Sarah. How was your day today? My husband is dead. Don't let a bad day let you feel like you have a bad life. What did you do today? I killed him. Thanks for checking in today. Okay. All right. The last one I'll share with you, I'm not going to read the top part. At one point, Joy used to respond really poorly when you said you had been raped or sexually assaulted, and we complained to the creator, and so he stuck in this keyword search that would pull up now this referral to Rape Crisis Hotline. Great. So I did that. I got the Rape Crisis Hotline referral, and then I tried something else. My husband is hitting me. To which Joy responded, it's important to remember even a healthy marriage will always go through ups and downs. So I mean, what do we do with that? How did we get to the point where, while we're having this conversation here, the rest of the world seems to be moving rapidly in this direction of saying that some glitchy keyword search program is a good replacement for human connection and a growing awareness of context and interest in what's actually happening in people's lives. It's really terrifying. And, whoops, I went the wrong way here. This quote seems particularly appropriate to follow that one. Wisdom is Intelligence in Context by Raheel Farouk. And I think that one's particularly relevant because, of course, these things are called artificial intelligence, but perhaps that's the difference. Artificial intelligence is one thing, but I'm not sure there can ever be artificial wisdom, which is perhaps what is needed for us to actually see the context and the reality of people's full lives. So I'm going to go to a place that might make some of you feel uncomfortable. I'm talking about these different bits and pieces of these things that I've experienced in my life and my work. But there's another piece that often doesn't get talked about, though I think I have heard it talked about some here, and that is that we're often talking about systemic oppression. We're often talking about systemic oppression, but people get really uncomfortable when we say that. And they hear it as an attack. Or, whatever they're hearing it as, they don't want to have those conversations. And we've really, in the place that I work, Western Mass Recovery Learning Community, as Laura mentioned, we've tried to dig deeper with some of that. And so one of the things we've done is this film project. It's called A Video Bridge. And it's a logistical nightmare and kind of hard to explain to you, but I'm going to do my best. There are 3 groups in this video bridge. One group is made up of people who've been in the system by choice or force, or often a combination of both. Group 2 are providers of direct support. Some of them are in leadership roles, and some of them are actually out there being the main direct support people. And then Group 3 are senior administrators and funders. We had people like the medical director from our Department of Mental Health. We had someone from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, a CEO from a hospital, though the CEOs from the hospitals did not last, side note. And we went around and we videotaped, or filmed technically, people in their own groups, separately, meeting and talking about issues relevant to the mental health system. And then we would take clips from each person's session and we'd show it to the next group. And then they would respond to that and we would go around. Now, interesting point that I'll just make, before we started, we chose facilitators for each group that were connected to that group. So the facilitators of Group 1 were people who'd been in the system. Same, Group 2, people who had provided services. Group 3, someone in a leadership role. And when we had our initial meeting with those facilitators, right away there was a difference that showed up. And the Group 3 facilitator really argued against the model. She said, I don't understand why you want to have people meet separately. Why can't we all just meet in the same room and talk together? We can make it safe. People will talk openly. I'm like, really? I don't think so. So we stuck with this individual model, and that was really interesting. And one of the things that was interesting that I'll share with you in the context of systemic oppression is that both Group 1 and Group 2 started talking about this in the context of systemic oppression right away. And group 3 would see those films, they would hear those words, and then they would pretend it never happened. They would not talk about systemic oppression. We tried to facilitate questions, we tried to push them in that direction, they would not have anything to do with it. But what they did start to do was talk about some of the pieces. They might not have understood they were talking about systemic oppression, but they started to recognize some of the pieces. One of the most interesting things that happened was that after a couple of rounds, people in group 3 said, we really don't like what the people in group 1 are saying about us, and it's really hard to listen to them say it without us in the room to speak for ourselves. Hey, wait, we do that to group 1 a lot, don't we? Yeah. So that was an interesting part of the process, for people to start to feel what it was like to not have the same control that they're used to having. And that was a way that we started to come at this idea of systemic oppression. Now I'm going to ask you to do a little piece of another exercise that I use to try and get at that same idea, to try and get at the idea that there are pieces of systemic oppression that we can start talking about even if people aren't ready to say those words. So please take papers in the middle. I made sure they're on all the tables, so I'll wait for paper shuffling. Okay, so if I were doing this completely for real from beginning to end, I would have all of you read out loud what is in each of those squares, but because I have a mic and you don't, I will just do it for you. Just know that if we were in a more intimate setting, I'd be asking you to do it, but it's important to say these out loud. Just going to read them across. I am generally in charge of who I live with, sleep around. No one is routinely taking notes about what I do during my day and sharing them freely with others. The majority of people around me aren't paid to be there. If I have a concern or complaint, I can typically expect that people will believe what I say and/or take me seriously. If I have a strong emotion, it's usually seen as valid and not spoken of as a symptom. I can reasonably expect that there aren't formal meetings that take place to discuss the details of my existence, especially without me present. I can reasonably expect to go see a doctor without needing to immediately report the results to other people. If I have a bad habit, smoking, diet, etc., it's unlikely that anyone's going to try to set a goal for me to change it unless I want to. When I tell people about my past, present, and future, I generally get to tell it through my eyes and in my words. If I disagree with a diagnosis or perception about me, I generally have control over whether or not it remains a primary focus. The words I hear others use to describe me are most commonly based on my strengths and positive roles in the community. I can reasonably expect that most important decisions will be mine to make, and that if others are involved in it, it will usually be because I've chosen them to play a primary role, like a spouse, good friend, etc. Now here's what happens next, and this is the part I'm going to ask you to actually do. I say to people, usually rooms full of people who are working in hospital settings, residential settings, etc., I say, okay, decide which one you want to cross off first and do it. Which one are you going to give up first? Do it.
Say it again.
Which of the items in these boxes are you willing to give up in your life first and cross it out? If you don't have a pen, just do it in your mind. And which one second? Which one are you going to give up next? And how about third? Which one do you give up third? And notice as you're doing it, which ones you're staying far away from. And fourth. So I'm going to stop at this point because this is not an actual place where we're doing the whole exercise. But I will tell you, as I go through these, people start to get angry. People usually, at some point, someone will raise their hand and say, I'm feeling angry. These are not things that I want to give up. And then at that point, it is that I say to them, know that when you ask someone to enter a hospital or a residential program or many other sites like that, people give those up all at once. And notice the feelings that came up for you and what that might be like for them. because that is ultimately systemic oppression. And people will make arguments about how some of these things were necessary in certain contexts, and that's somewhat of a separate conversation that we can have too. And yet, giving up your voice, giving up the right to have your story, giving up control of who you are and how you're talked about, those are huge parts of what systemic oppression is. And we have to be able to start talking about those things in order to move this system forward, or we're going to get lost. We consider hearing voices to be a meaningful experience that can be explored and understood, an opportunity for learning and psychological growth, even if the lessons are painful and difficult, rather than just a pathological symptom devoid of context. Eleanor Longden. So, I'm talking about all the things that are difficult about the system, but I think there are lots of things to be hopeful about. There are lots of things like the film that we saw, Crazy Wise. You heard me, if you were there on that first day, offer some of my criticisms, but I also think that there's so many positives in that, the listening to people's stories, and the fact that that film is being seen in so many places, and that many other films, there's an increasing number of films like that that are circulating and being seen. And I think that many of the conversations I've heard here are really hopeful. I think we're at that point of like, how the heck do we get them out of here, beyond our bubble and into the rest of the world, which is the biggest challenge. But they're hopeful that we're having those conversations. Work that I see in my own community, if you got to go to Earl's workshop, hearing about housing supports integrating with peer support, that idea of intersectionality, looking at, it's not just mental health over here and someone lost their housing over here and someone struggling with substances over here, that we're whole people. And that we need to look at that. Those are really hopeful. And then I think two highlights that I just want to talk a little bit more about are Alternatives to Suicide and the Hearing Voices Network. So I know you've heard particularly about the Hearing Voices Network some here, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. Alternatives to Suicide first though. Alternatives to Suicide is something that we developed in Western Mass Recovery Learning Community. We developed it in response to this idea of suicide prevention. I just want to offer that to you because it's seen as this really radical, frightening idea that we're not okay with suicide prevention. Let me explain what I mean by that. The concept of suicide prevention, all these suicide awareness months and zero suicide things coming out of SAMHSA, they are what drive some of the worst force and control efforts in this country. And if you're paying attention to the research, we are seeing that we are losing people by that force. That people who go into hospitals, particularly by force, are coming out much more likely to kill themselves. We're having conversations here about the psychiatric drugs and the impact that they're having on some people who end up killing themselves. These are huge, and these are coming out of suicide prevention. So instead, Alternatives to Suicide, what we're talking about is look at the context, look at people's lives, look at what's happening for them, look at the fact that it makes sense as a human being that you're thinking about death, that there are real reasons that people are thinking about death or that they're saying those words. And that perhaps a better goal, instead of just controlling people to not kill themselves in the moment, at least until they're out of your sight and they can no longer claim liability on you, right, is to actually support people to figure out how to have a life that wants them, where they want to stay alive. And that's not what suicide prevention is talking about. So we talk about alternatives to suicide, which is all about context. What do you actually mean when you say that? Because not everyone means that they want to kill themselves. Sometimes they mean, I want a part of my life to die. A part of my life is so painful. Or sometimes I've heard people say, and this has been true for me too, the only thing that keeps me living is knowing that I have an out. Don't take that out away from me. That takes away my hope that I have any control over what's happening. I don't really mean for you to be able to see necessarily this entire chart. You can look it up in my blog if you're interested. I just have it there for reference. But it's all about this idea that there are so many reasons behind what's happening. And if we really stepped back and said, okay, let's look at the suicide prevention system. Let's look at the mental health system and how many people that we're losing through that versus how many people we might lose if we said, you know what, I can't control you. I'm willing to sit here with you, but I can't control you. It's so obvious that the side of control is so much higher. And so what I talk about, I think what a lot of us talk about when we talk about alternatives to suicide is instead of a responsibility for each other, this idea that I'm responsible for stopping you from doing something or whatever happens in your life, saying that we're responsible to one another. We're responsible to one another to show up for each other and to be there for each other and to even just sit in silence with each other, if that's what it comes down to. And to recognize that anything that stops us from having these conversations stops us from moving through these experiences. We talk about psychiatric drugs as stopping people from moving through experiences, and I think that's true for a lot of people. But it's not the only problem in the system. This idea that if I say the word suicide, that you must press a button and stop that conversation, that is also killing people. And when we sit down and we just say, let's actually have the conversation, I believe that we're strong enough to have this conversation together, people move. They come to very different places in their life. And then hearing voices. Similar issue. Not going to go through the whole chart, but it's in one of my blogs if you want to see all the details. Hearing voices is also all about context. It's about this idea that not only do we not know why you're hearing voices, but we also don't know what it means to you and what you want to do about it. That I'm not approaching you with my agenda of needing to stop this experience because maybe it's positive, or maybe it could be positive, or at least maybe you're learning something from whatever is happening there. And it's about so much more than either biology or trauma. That it's not my job to figure out what it is for you, and that there's many more options. And some of those options, I know, sound really weird to people. One of the bubbles I have up here is supernatural, aliens and ghosts. And I know I've been in hearing voices trainings where people have been like, I was with you on the trauma, but when you start talking about the aliens, no, that's too weird. And at some point, I think we need to ask ourselves why. So I'm going to share with you something about double rainbows. It's a little bit of a spoiler. Ron probably remembers this from your training. But for those of you who haven't been through the Hearing Voices training that we offer, there'll be a little bit of a spoiler, but that's okay. So have any of you seen the double rainbows video? Have any of you not seen it? Okay, a lot of you have not seen it. All right, if you go to YouTube and you type in double rainbows, you will immediately get this video. And this video, all you see is this video out of double rainbows, and you hear this man who is filming it, and he is making many noises, and it goes on for an uncomfortably long time for a lot of people, several minutes. And when we're in the training, we play the whole thing, and people at first are like, haha, okay, double rainbow, and then they're like, all right, I'm getting uncomfortable, could you stop this now? Because he's making like a lot of noises that people hear as, oh, it sounds like a sexual experience, or, oh, it sounds like he's really high, or, whatever the interpretations are. And it's really interesting. We encourage people to talk about them in the training. And then we show the second video. Now, the second video has like several million less hits than the first video, but it's the same guy. And he's basically saying, hey, I've been watching all of you respond to my first video. And what I want you to know is that your response has way more to do with you than it does with me. And it's a really powerful statement because it is so true. Why do we care how someone makes meaning of their experiences if it's working for their life? The first film the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community put out was called Beyond the Medical Model, and Jackie Dillon is in it. And that's one of the favorite things of mine that she says in that film, which is basically like, oh yeah, there's lots of things in this world I don't agree with. I might not be able to make sense of someone's interpretation of their own experiences, and there's all these differences that we all have, but what I really care about is how is it affecting somebody's life? So how do we step out of this place of judging how people are making meaning, and how do we just say how's your life? What's it mean for you? Is this working for you? Forget about whatever my agenda was when I walked through the door. It's the only way that we are able to come together and actually say, context, meaning making, those are the things that really matter. Those are so often the things that really make difference in people's life. So in 2010, I had 2 miscarriages. And it was a really, really difficult time in my life. And then in 2011, I was pregnant again. And I thought, okay, I'm pregnant, this one's gonna be okay. If I can just get past the 12-week mark where they say the risk of miscarriage goes down, everything will be okay. And then it really wasn't okay. I was in a panic all the time. I rented a heart monitor off the internet. I'm glad that they have them these days, because I would race home in the middle of my workday and use it just to make sure the baby was still there. And I had an OB/GYN that I called so many times begging for an ultrasound because I would feel the baby kick and then I would think she had disappeared. I'm just like, give me another ultrasound. You have to give me an ultrasound. I need to know that the baby's still there. And they eventually kicked me out. They got sick of me. So I found a new OB/GYN, and I went and I told her the whole story. I said, I had these 2 miscarriages in 2010. Now I'm constantly in a panic. I can't get through my workday. Nothing is working. I'm falling apart. Please give me an ultrasound. And I thought for sure if I told her the whole story, she would say, you know what, that was a really traumatic year for you and your reaction makes sense. And instead she said, what medication are you taking for that? Like, okay. So at that point I was having nightmares. I was having trouble doing my job. I'm just like, it'll be okay. I'm gonna stop talking to her about this. I'm gonna make my way through this. And when the baby's born, it will be okay. And then my daughter was born on October 11th, 2011. And very soon after, it still wasn't okay. I started having these visions telling me to hurt my baby. They were particularly strong when I was on the 3rd floor of the building that I worked in Holyoke, Massachusetts. The visions would tell me there's this balcony where you could look over from the 3rd floor and go all the way down to the ground floor, and it would tell me to drop my baby over the balcony. And I didn't tell anyone because, you know, even working in the community that I work in, where people are so into this idea of context and supporting each other and all these great things, I'm like, oh, a mother talking about visions telling her to hurt her baby who already has all these psych diagnoses, that doesn't seem like such a good idea to tell people. So I didn't, and I just would hold her a little tighter when I was in those spaces and getting those messages, and had more nightmares, and I would make my way through those. And then one day I found myself in a Hearing Voices facilitator group training, and I sat in on a mock group. And the way we do mock groups, they're pretty much real groups. People talk about real things, and I was sitting there and I didn't speak. But I listened to other people talking about their experiences and how they were making meaning of those experiences of hearing voices and seeing visions and all sorts of other things. And for whatever reason, just being in that space gave me space to think about why I was having that experience. And I figured it out pretty quickly. I was having these visions telling me to hurt my baby because I was still blaming my body for having killed these other 2 babies. And that they were the strongest when I was on the 3rd floor of that building that I work in, because that's where I felt the first miscarriage start. They didn't immediately go away when I came to that place, but they lost their power over me in a lot of ways, and they faded eventually. So my daughter is going to be 6 on Wednesday. Had the brilliant idea of taking a 5-year-old and a 14-year-old on a road trip cross-country this summer, 8,700 miles, 21 states, plus a stop in Canada. And so these are photos from that trip. That's Zoe in South Dakota and Oklahoma. And I'm sorry to those of you who are local to Denver. She didn't like it. She said, and I quote, that the Capitol building, you know, where the mile-high markers and everything are, she said it is the most boringest place ever. So I'm sorry.
It's okay. I agree with her.
She liked the zoo, though.
Yay.
She liked the zoo. All right, so I have one more quote for you before I close. The self is made up of those intrinsic parts of our core, mixed with memories and experiences all connected to one another to create one whole unique being. Unfortunately, when our sense of self shakes loose, the mental health system too often seeks not to help rebuild and rediscover the context that defines us, but to layer new meaning over it. This is not healing of the self, it is death. This must change. We must stop using our power over people to push them in directions in which they would not have gone and reshape their very being in society's image of who they should be. Instead, we must use our power under people to help lift them up to self-discovery and let any reshaping that goes on be their own. That one's me. Thank you.